before I begin, I want to let you know that I have spared you a grisly fate. My original intention was to preach extemporaneously, or at the very most with just the barest of notes. This has become actually fairly standard among clergy in the last 2 decades, and I love the informality and the personal touch, but I had to come to grips with the fact that this is not how my mind works. I lack the mental discipline. I am more prone to free association and wandering here, there, and everywhere. There are times when I will be in conversation with Steve and he'll stop me and say, "Now, are you going anywhere with this thought, or are you just taking it out for a stroll?" So, out of respect for you, I am here, manuscript in hand, and I'm thinking about 10, 15 minutes from now we will all be much happier people. Well, you may not know this, but I was once Batgirl. It all began in the summer of 1985. I graduated from seminary in June and received my first appointment as the associate pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Fort Atkinson. I was apprehensive. After years of collecting degrees, this was my first full-time professional job. I was also a little concerned about my credibility. I was 27 at the time. I looked about 12, maybe 13. Would I be taken seriously? Well, it was quickly put to the test. About a week after I arrived, the church held a reception for me in their enormous fellowship hall. Within about 15 to 20 minutes of everybody arriving, I started to notice quick, agitated movements. And then I heard shrieks and squeaks and screams, and I looked up to see a couple of bats flying around, periodically swooping down and dive-bombing the crowd. Well, several minutes later, a few burly men came rushing into the fellowship hall, armed with brooms and tennis rackets, and eventually got the bats out into the hallway, where I assumed they would just keep leading them out until they made their way out the front door. So, curious, I wandered into the hallway to see what was happening, and was actually quite horrified to discover that they were attempting to corner the bats and beat them to death. So, I pulled myself up to my full stature, and I put on my best adult voice and said, "Gentlemen, stop, please stop." Well, they were so stunned they did. And then I explained to them that in the state of Wisconsin, the brown bat is protected by law. Now, I had lived in Wisconsin all of 1 week by that time, and I didn't actually know that to be a fact. But I am not above making things up when I'm in a pinch. So, we had a conversation that went something like this, because the bats were still very much present and quite agitated by this time. And I said, "Why is it necessary to kill them? Can't you just leave them alone, wait till they make their way out?" Well, they probably won't. They get inside the building, the radar doesn't work very well, they get disoriented, they get trapped. Well, how about if we seal off their entrances, take care of the problem once and for all? With all due respect, Reverend, that would be a lot of work. Bats can come and go through very, very small openings, and this is a very large church. Well, then let's tell the trustees. They can do something about it. We are the trustees. Even better, thanks for taking this one on. Well, I'm not sure they actually intended to follow through on my very first executive order. But in the weeks that followed, as I would periodically put on large outfits and make my way through the church, scooping stranded bats off the wall and releasing them outside, they did stand up and take notice, and decided that a pastor with rabies was not the kind of publicity they were seeking. So they took this project on, and the bat traffic patterns were identified and sealed off, even bearing in mind their routine in and out during the day and night, making sure that as many bats were outside as possible before they sealed off these small crevices. That was the start of several months of experiences that heightened my awareness of caring for God's creation. Later that summer, I discovered an abandoned kitten underneath a shrub right outside the church. I brought it into the office where the lead pastor explained to me that this was actually a very common occurrence in that area. people would drop off their unwanted animals in front of churches, hoping that some soft touch would take responsibility for them. So I called my seminary roommate, Carly, who lived 30 miles away, and told her that I was on my way to her home with a kitten. To which she responded, "Oh, really? I wasn't aware I needed a cat." But she gave him a wonderful home for the duration of his life, and he later did return the favor. As a result, I became involved in animal rescue organizations and looked for opportunities to educate others about the plight of unwanted animals. Among other things, this involved bringing my youth group to animal shelters to do volunteer work and encouraging them to look for opportunities to help. One of them took me quite seriously and showed up at youth group one evening with a very tiny kitten in the palm of her hand, telling me that this little guy's mother and the rest of the litter had feline leukemia, and if he was not removed and adopted immediately, he stood at very, very high risk of contracting it as well. What could I do? Practice what you preach. I took the kitten. When Sunday school began that fall, one of the classes decided they wanted to take on an environmental issue, and they turned their attention to recycling, which was still a fairly new concept since curb recycling was not yet available. And equipped with the slogan, "Bring your trash to church," they contracted with a local recycling company to bring one of their large bins into the parking lot once a month so people could come to church, sort, and drop off their recycling instead of throwing it in the trash where it would end up in a landfill. And the idea actually caught on within the community, and soon a number of other opportunities for recycling presented themselves. As I reflected on these experiences, I realized that in many ways I had come full circle. That caring for creation had been part of my life, part of my awareness since my earliest memory. And I have to tell you, I'm extremely allergic to creation. And my allergy medication is just kicking in. But my dad was a pastor and one of the most brilliant scholars I've ever known. And so as a child, I have to admit I didn't understand much of what he said. But I do recall his passion for social justice, which included a number of environmental issues. Much of what I first learned about food scarcity and the importance of local farming came from him. He purchased beef and poultry from parishioners, and he preached about the importance of supporting small farms, not factory farms. He advocated helping people grow their own produce, although I have to admit I never once saw him pull a weed in our oversized garden. There were times when his quest for living close to the land did take a weird turn. Like the time he bought chickens from a parishioner. Live chickens. So this guy, who grew up in the inner city of Boston, suddenly decides he's going to butcher chickens. I'll spare you the details, but it was chaos. And the fact that I was standing around the corner of the house making coyote sounds and yelling, "Run, chickens, run!" It did not help the situation at all. My mother has always been an ardent environmentalist, citing this as an extension of how she believes we are to care for God's creation. Her passions range from saving wildlife and forests to sustainable eating. As a child, I recall choking down everything from dandelion greens to cattails, at the same time feeling quite jealous of my classmates who were grazing on Twinkies and Wonder Bread. My siblings and I helped her plant trees, shrubs, plants, anything that would provide habitat and food for wildlife. And I would have to admit that I was well into adulthood before I gardened voluntarily. We took in stray dogs and the occasional rabbit, never cats because my dad was deathly allergic to them. We also nursed a number of wild creatures back to health, including a woodpecker that we imaginatively named Peppy, which for me still stands as proof that children should never be allowed to name animals. And long before such ideas became mainstream, we were required to turn off lights when we left a room, to turn off the water when we brushed our teeth, to reuse, recycle in any way possible. As with my dad, my mother's approach did have its quirks and pitfalls. She will not kill anything, not even an ant. So every summer, as the ants were making their way into our house, as they do in everyone's she would institute her catch and release program. So the idea was to put out small saucers of sugar, thinking the ants would all be attracted to that, and she would then put them outside. So every summer you could see a line of ants at the curb outside her house going, "Hey, lady in here's having a party! Everybody come!" We had ants everywhere. To this day, she live traps mice and brings them out to her garden where they wait a few minutes and they scurry back in laughing all the way. But I do admire her dedication. At 80, my mother remains actively involved in the care of creation and mystified by what she feels is the failure of organized religion to adequately address